He threw me a fake anniversary party just to serve divorce papers. I wanted an audience, he laughed. I smiled, took out a silk-wrapped box, and asked his mother to open it. She froze, stared at him, and walked out in silence. He never followed. The divorce papers hit my chest like a slap. "Surprise, sweetheart," Jake whispered in my ear, his breath hot against my neck as 300 guests watched us from below. The spotlight burned my skin, but not as much as his words. I wanted an audience for this. My hands didn't shake as I took the manila envelope. They should have. Any normal wife would have crumbled right there on that ridiculous stage he'd built in the middle of our anniversary party. But I wasn't any normal wife anymore. "You planned this," I said quietly, my voice steady despite the roar of blood in my ears. "Before we continue, I want to thank you for joining me in sharing these stories of women who refuse to be victims. If you believe that truth and justice should prevail over lies and manipulation, please consider subscribing. It's free and helps us reach more women who need to hear this. Now let's see how this unfolds." His smile was pure venom wrapped in expensive veneers. Every last detail. The flowers, the champagne, the guest list, even that dress you're wearing. Midnight blue, wasn't it? Because I told you once it made your eyes unforgettable. He chuckled, the sound making my skin crawl. "I wanted you to look perfect when I destroyed you." The crowd below us was a sea of open mouths and raised phones. Someone gasped. A champagne glass shattered against marble. But all I could hear was Jake's confession echoing in my head. He'd orchestrated this entire night just to humiliate me in front of everyone we knew. 5 years, I breathed, staring at the envelope in my hands. 5 years of marriage, and this is how you end it? This is how you end things with style, Brooke. With an audience. With impact. He straightened his bow tie like he'd just delivered the performance of his life. "People will talk about this for years." That's when I saw her. Melissa Cartwright stood near the back wall, trying to blend into the shadows between 2 marble columns. But that red hair of hers caught every light in the room like a flame. She was biting her lower lip, her green eyes fixed on Jake with the kind of worship that made me want to vomit. He knew. She'd known this was coming. "How long?" I asked, still holding those papers. "How long what? How long have you been planning to serve me divorce papers at our anniversary party? How long have you been sleeping with your marketing director? How long have you been lying to my face every single day?" Jake's confident mask slipped for just a second. Just long enough for me to see the real him underneath. Petty, cruel, and so pathetically insecure that he needed to destroy his wife in public to feel powerful. "Does it matter?" He shrugged, already turning away from me. "You'll sign them either way. Your lawyer will call my lawyer. We'll split everything down the middle, and you'll disappear quietly like the good little wife you've always been." That's what he thought. That I'd take this humiliation and slink away into the shadows. That I'd let him have his moment of triumph and fade into obscurity while he rode off into the sunset with his young mistress. But Jake had made one critical error in his grand plan. He'd assumed I was the same naive woman who'd married him 5 years ago. The same trusting wife who'd believed his lies about working late, about business trips, about loving me. He thought I'd been sitting at home, oblivious and helpless, while he built his exit strategy. What he didn't know was that I'd been building my own. The blood type discrepancy had been an accident. A simple mistake during his routine physical that sent me spiraling down a rabbit hole I never expected to find. When Jake's medical records showed he was O negative, but both his parents were A positive, my world tilted sideways. Basic genetics had taught me that was impossible. So I'd hired Marcus Chin, the best private investigator money could buy. I'd used Jake's own money to fund the search that would eventually destroy him. The irony was delicious. Marcus had found everything. The forged birth certificate. The altered hospital records. The hushed-up scandal from 30 years ago when Jennifer Mitchell had an affair with her husband's business partner. The DNA test that proved Jake wasn't Robert Mitchell's son, and therefore had no legal claim to the Mitchell family fortune. Jake had built his entire identity on a lie. His name, his inheritance, his place in society, all of it was stolen. And now I was going to take it all away. I reached into my evening bag, my fingers finding the silk-wrapped box I'd placed there hours earlier. The box that contained photocopies of every document Marcus had uncovered, along with a handwritten letter I'd discovered in Jennifer's personal effects when she was hospitalized last month. A letter she'd written to her husband, confessing everything. A letter she'd never had the courage to send. "You're right, Jake," I said, my voice carrying clearly in the stunned silence of the ballroom. "People will talk about this for years." I stepped away from him, turning to face the crowd below. 300 faces stared back at me. Friends, family, business associates, and social climbers who'd come to see the Mitchells celebrate another year of marital bliss. Instead, they were about to witness the complete destruction of a man who'd built his life on lies. "But first," I continued, walking down the stage steps with my head held high, "I have a gift of my own to share." I made my way through the parted crowd, ignoring the whispers and stares, until I reached the front row where Jennifer Mitchell sat frozen in her chair. Jake's mother looked like she'd seen a ghost, probably because she had. The ghost of her past had finally come to collect. "Jennifer," I said softly, extending the silk-wrapped box toward her with a smile that felt like broken glass. "Would you mind opening this for me? I think you'll recognize the contents." Her face went white as fresh snow. Her hands trembled as she reached for the box, and I could see the exact moment she realized what was inside. Behind me, Jake's voice cracked like a whip. "Brooke, what the hell do you think you're—" "Shut up, Jake," I said without turning around. "For once in your miserable life, just shut up and let someone else have the spotlight." The box felt heavier in Jennifer's shaking hands than it had any right to. 300 people held their breath, phones recording every second, as she slowly untied the blue ribbon with fingers that looked like they might snap. This was it. The moment Jake's perfect world crumbled into dust. The moment I showed him what real revenge looked like. Jennifer's fingers moved like they were made of glass, each motion threatening to shatter. The silk ribbon fell away and she stared at the contents as if they might bite her. Inside the box lay a single folded letter, yellowed with age and worn from handling. Her handwriting. Her words. Her confession. "No," she whispered so quietly that only those in the front row could hear. But the microphone Jake had insisted on wearing caught everything. Her denial echoed through the ballroom like a prayer no one wanted to answer. I watched her unfold the paper with the same care someone might use to handle a live bomb. Because that's exactly what it was. 30 years of buried secrets about to explode in the most public way possible. "Read it, Jennifer," I said gently, my voice carrying an authority I'd never known I possessed. "Out loud. Let everyone hear what you wrote to your husband all those years ago." She looked up at me with eyes that held decades of fear. "Please, Brooke. Not like this. Not in front of everyone." "Like what?" Jake's voice cut through the silence, sharp with irritation. He jumped down from the stage and was striding toward us, his face flushed with anger. "What is this melodrama? Mother, what's in that letter?" Jennifer's mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air. The paper trembled in her grip and I could see tears forming at the corners of her eyes. Tears she'd probably been holding back for 3 decades. "She can't read it," I said, taking a step closer to Jake. "Because it destroys everything you think you know about yourself. Everything you've built your precious identity on." "Brooke, I don't know what game you're playing, but—" "No game, Jake. Just truth. Something you've never been particularly fond of." Jennifer's voice cracked like autumn leaves. "My dearest Robert," she began, her words barely audible. The crowd pressed closer, phones held high, everyone straining to hear. "I can no longer carry this burden alone. What I'm about to tell you will change everything, and I pray you can find it in your heart to forgive me." Jake went rigid. "Mother, stop." But Jennifer couldn't stop now. The dam had broken and 30 years of guilt came pouring out. The winter of 1993 was the loneliest of my life. You were traveling constantly for work and I felt invisible in my own home. When David returned from Chicago, when he looked at me like I mattered, her voice caught. "I made a choice that haunts me every day." The name hit Jake like a physical blow. David Patterson. His father's former business partner, the man who'd been like an uncle to him growing up. The man who'd mysteriously moved to California when Jake was 5 and never spoke to the family again. "You had an affair," Jake said flatly, his lawyer's brain already connecting dots he didn't want to see. Jennifer nodded, tears streaming down her cheeks now. "For 3 months. 3 months of feeling alive again, of feeling wanted. And then," she pressed her hand to her mouth, fighting back a sob. "Then I discovered I was pregnant." The ballroom had gone silent except for the soft whir of phone cameras and the distant sound of someone's nervous breathing. 300 people watching a family implode in real time. You told Daddy the baby was his, Jake said, his voice hollow. I was terrified, Jennifer continued reading, her voice growing stronger with each word. The timing was close enough. Robert had been home for a weekend in February. I convinced myself it could be his child. I wanted it to be his child. Jake's face had gone pale as marble. But you knew it wasn't. The doctor who delivered you, Jennifer whispered, looking directly at her son. Dr. Harrison. He was David's cousin. He knew about the affair. David had confided in him when he was struggling with the guilt. When you were born, when he ran the blood tests. She swallowed hard. He came to me privately. Told me the results proved you weren't Robert's son. So you bribed him, I said, filling in the blanks I'd pieced together from the private investigator's report. You paid him to falsify the records. Jennifer nodded miserably. $50,000. Money I'd inherited from my grandmother. Dr. Harrison changed the blood type documentation, backdated some records, made it look like there had been a clerical error in the original typing. He said no one would ever question it. Jake staggered backward like he'd been punched. My entire life. My name, my inheritance, my place in this family, it's all based on a lie. I thought I was protecting you, Jennifer said, her voice breaking completely now. I thought I was giving you the life you deserved. The Mitchell name, the social standing, the financial security. How could I take that away from an innocent child? By lying to everyone. Jake exploded, his composure finally cracking. By lying to Dad, to me, to everyone who ever mattered. But Jennifer wasn't finished. She looked down at the letter again and I saw her steel herself for the final blow. The one I'd been waiting for. There's more, she said quietly. Jake's laugh was bitter and broken. More? What else could there possibly be? Jennifer's eyes found mine across the space between us, and for a moment, I saw something that looked almost like gratitude. She knew this needed to come out. She'd been drowning in this secret for 30 years, and I'd just thrown her a lifeline, even if it looked like an anchor to everyone else. I wrote this letter 5 years ago, she continued, her voice steadying. The night before your wedding. I was going to tell Robert everything, was going to confess and let him decide what to do. But then I met Brooke. Jake's head snapped toward me, confusion replacing some of the anger in his eyes. She was so kind to me that day, Jennifer said, her voice warming slightly. During all the wedding chaos, when everyone else was focused on flowers and photographs and seating arrangements, she noticed I was overwhelmed. She brought me tea, sat with me, asked about my life. Really asked. Not the polite small talk I was used to, but genuine interest. I remembered that afternoon. Jennifer had seemed lost in the whirlwind of wedding preparations, sitting alone while Jake glad-handed his way through a room full of vendors and wedding planners. Over the past 5 years, Jennifer continued, Brooke has been the daughter I never had. She called me every week, visited me in the hospital when I had my surgery last year, remembered my birthday when my own son forgot. She cared for me when no one else bothered. Jake's face twisted with something ugly. So what, mother? So what if she was nice to you? That doesn't change what you did. Jennifer looked directly at him, and for the first time all evening her voice was steady and clear. No, it doesn't change what I did. But it changes what I should have done. Because watching Brooke these past 5 years, seeing her kindness and her strength and her grace. She paused, gathering herself for the final strike. It made me realize that you, Jacob, are nothing like the man who raised you. You're selfish, cruel, and petty. You inherited your biological father's worst traits and none of Robert's best ones. The letter fluttered to the floor as Jennifer stood, her voice rising to carry across the entire ballroom. Brooke is the daughter I should have had. The child I should have raised. She has more integrity in her little finger than you've shown in your entire life. Jake stood frozen, his mouth hanging open, as 300 people absorbed the complete destruction of everything he'd thought he knew about himself. And I smiled. The silence that followed Jennifer's declaration lasted exactly 3 seconds. Then the ballroom erupted. Not with applause or gasps this time, but with something far more dangerous. The low electric buzz of 300 people processing scandal in real time. Conversations sparked like wildfire, spreading from cluster to cluster as the reality of what they'd just witnessed sank in. Did she just say? Not his real father. 30 years of lies. Illegitimate heir. The whispers grew louder, bolder. I watched faces transform as the implications hit them one by one. These weren't just party guests anymore. They were witnesses to the complete destruction of one of the city's most prominent families. Margaret Whitmore, who'd greeted me so warmly an hour ago, now stared at Jake like he was a stranger who'd wandered into her living room. Her perfectly applied lipstick had left a red stain on her champagne flute, forgotten in her shock. "This can't be real," someone muttered behind me. "The Mitchells are founding members of the country club. They've been pillars of this community for generations." "Apparently not," came the sharp reply. "Apparently they've been living a complete fraud." Jake stood frozen in the center of it all, his face cycling through emotions faster than I could track them. Denial, rage, humiliation, desperation, each one flickering across his features before being replaced by the next. His perfect hair was disheveled now, his bow tie askew. The golden boy facade was cracking in real time. But it was the shift in the crowd that truly fascinated me. These people had fawned over Jake for years, eager to bask in the reflected glory of his inherited wealth and social standing. Now they looked at him like he'd personally betrayed each one of them. Because in a way he had. Richard Blackstone, Jake's biggest business client, was already heading for the exit. His wife followed close behind, her heels clicking urgently against the marble floor. They didn't even glance back. In their world, association with scandal was almost as damaging as the scandal itself. "Jake." Richard's voice boomed across the ballroom before he reached the door. "We'll need to discuss our contract terms first thing Monday morning." Everyone heard the subtext. The Blackstone account, worth nearly $2 million annually, was about to disappear. Near the far wall, I spotted the cluster of Jake's fraternity brothers from Yale. Men who'd partied with him for 4 years, who'd stood up at our wedding, who'd been fixtures at every major milestone in our relationship. They were backing away from the scene like it was contaminated. "We should go," one of them whispered, but the microphone Jake still wore caught it anyway. "This is going to be all over social media in an hour." "Already is," another replied, holding up his phone. "Someone's streaming this live. It's got 3,000 viewers and climbing." Live streaming. Of course. In today's world, private humiliation was an impossibility. Jake's public execution was being broadcast to anyone with an internet connection. But the person I was really watching stood near the back corner where she tried to blend into the shadows all evening. Melissa Cartwright, Jake's red-haired secret, had gone completely white. Her emerald dress suddenly looked garish under the ballroom lights, like she was dressed for a different party entirely. She'd been so confident earlier, sipping her Prosecco and checking her phone for reassuring texts from her married lover. She'd probably been imagining this as her coming-out party, the night she'd finally step into the light as the future Mrs. Mitchell. Now she looked like she wanted to disappear into the floor. I watched her clutch her designer purse tighter as reality crashed over her. The man she'd been sleeping with wasn't the heir to a fortune. He was the illegitimate son of a 30-year-old affair. The inheritance she'd been counting on didn't exist. The social status she'd been craving was built on quicksand. Her phone buzzed in her hand. Probably a text from her roommate or sister asking if she was really at that party everyone was talking about online. I saw her read it, saw her face crumple slightly, saw her take one last look at Jake, still standing there in his expensive tuxedo, looking lost and broken, before she turned and walked toward the exit. She didn't run. That would have drawn attention. Instead, she moved with the careful precision of someone trying very hard not to be noticed. Head down, shoulders squared, handbag pressed against her side like armor. But I noticed. And more importantly, so did Jake. I saw his head turn, saw him spot her retreating figure. For a moment, something desperate flashed across his face. The look of a drowning man watching his life preserver float away. "Melissa," he called out, his voice cracking slightly. She paused at the ballroom entrance but didn't turn around. The entire crowd followed his gaze, 300 pairs of eyes landing on the woman who'd been his secret mistress just hours ago. Now she was just another guest who couldn't get away fast enough. She disappeared through the doorway without a word, leaving Jake standing there with his arms half raised, his mouth open, looking every bit the fool he'd always been beneath the expensive suits and inherited confidence. That's when the real exodus began. The Hendersons slipped out next, followed by the Carruthers family. Then Jake's golf buddies, his business associates, the social climbers who'd been so eager to curry favor with the Mitchell heir. One by one they melted away like morning frost. Some made excuses, early morning tomorrow, or babysitter needs to leave soon. Others just vanished without explanation, unwilling to be photographed at the scene of such spectacular social destruction. But the cruelest departures were the ones who'd been closest to him. Marcus Webb, his best man, caught Jake's eye across the room and simply shook his head slowly before walking away. No words, no explanation needed. 30 years of friendship ended with a single gesture. The Preston family, neighbors who'd been like surrogate grandparents to Jake, gathered their things with the kind of determined efficiency that spoke volumes. Mrs. Preston had taught Jake to ride a bicycle in her driveway when he was 6. Now she wouldn't even look at him. Within 15 minutes, the ballroom had emptied by 2/3. The remaining guests huddled in small groups, their voices low but their stares constant. They weren't staying out of loyalty, they were staying for the show, waiting to see how much lower Jake could fall. Through it all, I remained perfectly still. I didn't gloat or make speeches or demand attention. I simply stood there watching the man who'd tried to humiliate me discover what real humiliation felt like. The champagne in my glass had gone flat, but I took a sip anyway. Tasted like victory. Mrs. Lawton approached me then, her elderly face creased with concern. She'd been my neighbor since childhood, had known me long before I became a Mitchell. "Dear," she said softly, taking my free hand in both of hers. "Are you all right?" For the first time all evening, my smile was genuine. "I'm perfect, Mrs. Lawton. Thank you for asking." She squeezed my hand once, nodded knowingly, and walked away. That's when I knew it was time to leave. I'd stayed long enough to watch Jake's world collapse. Now I wanted to go home and pour myself a proper drink. Something that didn't taste like lies and broken promises. I set my empty champagne flute on a nearby table, picked up my small evening bag and walked toward the exit without looking back. Behind me, Jake's voice echoed through the half-empty ballroom. "Brooke, wait." "Brooke." But I didn't wait. I didn't need to. He'd wanted an audience for our ending. Now he had one for his. The valet brought my car around as I waited under the hotel's crystal canopy, breathing in the cool night air that felt like freedom. Behind me, through the floor-to-ceiling windows, I could see the remaining guests still clustered in the ballroom like vultures picking over carrion. But I wasn't looking back anymore. My phone buzzed with notifications, texts, missed calls, social media alerts. The story was already spreading beyond the ballroom walls, rippling out into the digital world where scandals lived forever. But I silenced it all and slipped the phone into my purse. Tonight belonged to me. The drive home through the empty streets felt surreal. Street lights painted golden pools on the asphalt, and the city seemed unusually quiet, as if the universe itself was holding its breath. I rolled down the windows and let the wind whip through my hair, not caring that it would ruin the perfect style Jake had once complimented. When I pulled into our driveway, my driveway, I corrected myself. The house stood dark and imposing against the star-filled sky. The Tudor-style mansion that Jake loved to show off to his friends, with its manicured gardens and imported stone facade. In a few hours, it would just be another piece of property in a very complicated legal puzzle. I kicked off my heels in the foyer and padded barefoot across the marble floor to the kitchen. The silence felt different now, not empty but expectant. Like the house itself was waiting to see what would happen next. I poured myself 3 fingers of the Macallan 25 that Jake kept locked in his study cabinet, the bottle he'd been saving for special occasions. Well, this certainly qualified. The whiskey burned beautifully as I wandered into the living room and settled into the leather chair that faced the window overlooking the garden. Outside, the security lights cast everything in stark black and white, making the world look like an old movie. My phone rang. Jake's ringtone. I let it go to voicemail. It rang again immediately. And again. By the 4th call, curiosity got the better of me. I answered without saying hello. "Brooke, thank God." His voice was ragged, desperate. "Where are you? We need to talk." "This is insane. You can't possibly believe what my mother said tonight. She's been having memory issues. The doctors said stress can cause delusions." "Jake." My voice was calm as still water. "Stop. You have to listen to me. I know you're angry about the divorce papers, but we can work this out. We can go to counseling, we can..." "Where are you calling from?" The question seemed to throw him. "What?" "I'm still at the hotel. In the parking garage. Everyone's gone, Brooke. Everyone. Even the staff won't look at me." I took another sip of his expensive whiskey. "Good. Good? What do you mean good?" My entire life just imploded on live television. Do you have any idea what this means for me? For my career? For your inheritance? I finished softly. The silence stretched between us like a chasm. You knew, he whispered finally. You knew before tonight. I've known for months, Jake. About David Patterson. About the falsified medical records. About Dr. Harrison taking $50,000 to hide the truth. I paused, letting that sink in. About everything. How? Your blood work from the physical in March. Negative, remember? But both your parents are A positive. Even you should have learned enough basic biology to know that's impossible. I heard him exhale sharply, probably remembering the same moment I did, when he joked about being adopted because the blood types didn't match. If only he'd known how close to the truth he was. So you hired someone, he said, his voice flat now. You investigated my family. I investigated my husband. Because when someone you love starts acting like a stranger, you either accept the lies or you dig for the truth. I chose truth. And this was your revenge? Destroying me in public. I stood and walked to the window, watching the shadows dance across the lawn. No, Jake. This was justice. You wanted to humiliate me in front of everyone we knew. You wanted an audience for my destruction. So I gave you an audience for yours. But you could have just told me privately. We could have handled this quietly like civilized people. The laugh that escaped me was sharp as broken glass. Civilized? Like serving your wife divorce papers at your anniversary party? Like sleeping with your employee for 8 months while lying to my face every single day? Like planning to steal half of everything I've worked for while you run off with a woman who's barely older than your college diplomas? He didn't answer. Couldn't answer. The difference between us, Jake, is that I only destroyed what was already fake. Your name, your inheritance, your reputation, none of it was ever real. You've been living someone else's life for 30 years. Brooke, please. I made mistakes, but you didn't make mistakes. You made choices. Every lie, every betrayal, every cruel decision, you chose all of it. Through the phone, I heard the distant sound of car doors slamming, engines starting. The last of the party guests finally leaving. Jake was alone in that parking garage, just like he'd be alone for the rest of his life. "Hi, Mother," he said suddenly. "You said you found that letter in her things. You violated her privacy, stole personal documents. I was bringing her fresh clothes when she was in the hospital, remember? The pneumonia scare in April? You were too busy with your marketing director to visit your own mother." The memory still stung. The letter fell out of one of her books. "I didn't steal it, Jake. I found it. And after 5 years of watching you take credit for everything your father built, watching you treat people like stepping stones to your success, I decided someone needed to know the truth. So you decided to play God with my life. No. I decided to stop playing victim in my own marriage." The silence stretched longer this time. When he spoke again, his voice was smaller, younger somehow. "What happens now? Now you figure out who you really are. Not Robert Mitchell's son. Not the heir to a fortune you never earned. Not my husband. Whoever that is. And us. There is no use, Jake. There hasn't been for a long time. Tonight just made it official." I heard him breathing on the other end of the line, heard the faint sound of traffic passing by the hotel. He was sitting in his car in an empty parking garage, probably still wearing that expensive tuxedo, probably still trying to figure out how his perfect plan had backfired so spectacularly. "I'm filing the divorce papers tomorrow," I said gently. "Under my maiden name. Carter. The name you always said sounded too common, too ordinary. Turns out it's the only real name in this marriage. Brooke. Goodbye, Jake." I ended the call and turned off the phone completely. Outside, a car turned into our neighborhood, some late-night reveler heading home from their own evening out. But they drove past without slowing, their headlights sweeping across the window briefly before disappearing into the darkness. I finished the whiskey and set the empty glass on the side table. Tomorrow I would start the process of untangling 5 years of shared finances, shared property, shared lies. Tonight I would sleep alone in my own bed in my own house with my own name. For the first time in months that sounded perfect. The first night I slept alone in our bed, I stared at the ceiling until dawn and let myself remember how it all began. Not the marriage, not the lies, but the moment I stopped being naive. It was a Tuesday in March when Jake came home from his annual physical, waving his blood work results like a victory flag. Clean bill of health, he announced, dropping the paperwork on the kitchen counter before heading to the shower. Doctor says I have the blood pressure of a 20-year-old. I was making dinner, barely paying attention when something on the lab report caught my eye. Blood type, O negative. I stared at those letters, fork suspended halfway to my mouth as I tasted the pasta sauce. That night, while Jake snored beside me, I pulled out the wedding album. Page after page of carefully posed photographs, but I stopped at one specific image. Jake flanked by both his parents at the reception, all three of them laughing at some joke I couldn't remember. Robert Mitchell's eyes were distinctly hazel with flecks of gold. Jennifer's were deep brown, almost black in the right light. But Jake's eyes had always been green. Bright emerald green. I'd taken enough biology classes to know the basics. Two brown-eyed parents couldn't produce a green-eyed child without some very specific recessive gene combinations. Combinations that were statistically unlikely. Add in the blood type mismatch and the probability dropped to nearly impossible. But people adopted children all the time. Families kept secrets. Maybe there was a simple explanation that everyone just preferred not to discuss. Except Jake had always been so proud of his Mitchell heritage. He wore it like armor, constantly referencing his bloodline, his genetic connection to the family's success. If he'd been adopted, surely he would have known? The questions ate at me for weeks. I found myself studying family photos with a magnifying glass, looking for resemblances that should have been obvious. Jake had Jennifer's stubborn chin, sure, but that could be coincidence. His height matched Robert's, but so did half the men in their social circle. It was ridiculous. I was seeing mysteries where none existed, creating problems in my marriage because I was bored or restless or looking for drama. That's what I told myself every morning while Jake kissed me goodbye and headed off to his important meetings. But then I found the photograph. I was cleaning out Robert's old desk in the study, a task Jennifer had been putting off since his death 2 years earlier, when I discovered a manila folder tucked behind the tax documents. Inside were dozens of pictures from Jake's childhood, but one made me stop breathing. Jake at 8 years old, standing next to a tall man with dark hair and green eyes. Bright, unmistakable green eyes. The same shade as Jake's. The man's hand rested on Jake's shoulder with casual familiarity, and they were both grinning at the camera like they shared a secret. On the back, someone had written, Jake and Uncle David, Christmas 1995. Uncle David. David Patterson, Robert's former business partner who'd mysteriously relocated to California when Jake was young. The man Jennifer never spoke about, whose name made her change the subject whenever it came up in conversation. I sat in that study for 2 hours, staring at that photograph, watching my world shift on its axis. The next Monday I hired Marcus Chin. Marcus came recommended by my divorce lawyer friend Sarah, though I told her I was looking into background checks for potential household staff. He was quiet, professional, and expensive enough that I knew he'd be thorough. I need you to investigate my husband's parentage, I told him during our first meeting at a coffee shop downtown. Specifically, I need to know if Robert Mitchell was actually his biological father. Marcus didn't blink. Any particular reason for the inquiry? Medical inconsistencies. Blood type discrepancies. A photograph that raises questions. And you want this kept completely confidential? Absolutely. If word of this investigation gets back to my husband or his family, I'll know it came from you. Marcus spent 6 weeks unraveling 30 years of carefully constructed lies. He found the original medical records from Jake's birth, the ones that showed his true blood type before Dr. Harrison changed them. He tracked down the retired nurse who'd assisted with the delivery and remembered being asked to keep certain details private. He located David Patterson in Sacramento, where he'd been living under his mother's maiden name for 3 decades. Most importantly, he found Jennifer's letter. She'd hidden it in a safety deposit box at a bank across town, along with other documents she never wanted Robert to see. The box was registered under her maiden name, opened the same week Jake was born. Marcus had connections at the bank who owed him favors. The letter was everything I'd suspected and worse. Jennifer's affair hadn't been a brief moment of weakness. It had lasted the entire winter of 1993. She'd been in love with David Patterson, had planned to leave Robert for him, until she discovered she was pregnant and panicked. Reading those handwritten pages felt like watching someone's soul confess its darkest secrets. Jennifer wrote about bribing Dr. Harrison, about convincing David to disappear, about lying to Robert every day for 30 years. She wrote about watching Jake grow up knowing he was living someone else's life. But the most devastating part was the ending, where she admitted that keeping the secret hadn't been about protecting Jake. It had been about protecting herself. Her reputation, her marriage, her place in society. Marcus handed me the file on a rainy Thursday afternoon, along with DNA evidence that confirmed what I already knew. Jake wasn't a Mitchell. Never had been. What do you plan to do with this information? Marcus asked as I signed his final check. I don't know yet. But that was a lie. I knew exactly what I was going to do. I just wasn't ready to admit it, even to myself. The plan came together slowly, piece by piece, over the following months. First, I started spending more time with Jennifer, visiting her weekly instead of monthly, bringing her favorite tea and listening to her stories about the past. She was lonely, especially since Robert's death, and she responded to my attention like a flower turning toward sunlight. I helped her organize her medications, drove her to doctor's appointments, sat with her during her hospital stay when she developed pneumonia in April. Jake was too busy with work, too busy with Melissa, to notice that his wife was becoming his mother's primary caregiver. Jennifer began confiding in me, sharing memories she'd never told anyone. Most of them were harmless nostalgia, but occasionally she'd let something slip that confirmed what I already knew. David always said Jake had his eyes, she murmured one afternoon while we sorted through old photographs. I used to worry people would notice the resemblance. When did David move away? I asked casually. When Jake was 5. Right after Robert promoted him to partner. The timing was perfect, really. Too perfect. She was testing me, I realized. Seeing how much I already knew, how much I could be trusted with her secrets. The breakthrough came during her recovery from the pneumonia. The pain medication made her drowsy and unguarded, and one evening while I was helping her change into fresh pajamas, she grabbed my wrist with surprising strength. He was never supposed to know, she whispered, her eyes unfocused but urgent. I promised David we'd take it to our graves. But watching you these past months, seeing how kind you are, how much you care, her voice broke. You're the daughter I should have raised. Not the son I lied about. That night, driving home from the hospital, I made my decision. Jake wanted to end our marriage with an audience? Fine. I'd give him the biggest audience he'd ever had. But the show wouldn't go according to his script. I let him plan the anniversary party, let him choose the venue and the guest list and the menu. I smiled and nodded when he showed me the invitation designs, acted surprised when he insisted on hiring professional photographers. I even helped him pick out his tuxedo. All the while I was planning my own surprise. The silk-wrapped box. The careful timing. The moment when Jennifer would have no choice but to reveal the truth she'd been hiding for 30 years. Jake thought he was orchestrating my destruction. Instead, he was building the stage for his own. 2 months later, I was standing knee-deep in a lake that had no name, watching minnows dart between my bare toes while coffee cooled in my favorite mug. The cottage I'd rented sat 50 yards behind me, weathered cedar shingles and a screen door that slammed with the most satisfying sound in the world. 1 bedroom. 1 bathroom. A kitchen the size of Jake's walk-in closet. A porch that faced east so I could watch the sun rise over water that belonged to no one and everyone. The exact opposite of everything my old life had been. I'd found this place on a Wednesday afternoon in late September, driving aimlessly through backroads after signing the final divorce papers. The realtor was a woman named Ruth who wore muddy hiking boots and didn't ask why I wanted to rent somewhere so remote. Previous tenant was a writer, she'd explained, showing me the interior with its pine walls and stone fireplace. Said the quiet helped her think. Course, some folks find this much quiet unsettling. It's perfect, I'd said before she'd finished the tour. That first morning, I'd woken up confused by the absence of sound. No traffic, no neighbors, no Jake's phone buzzing with important calls at 6 a.m. Just birds and water and wind through pine needles. I'd sat on the porch in my pajamas, drinking coffee that actually tasted like coffee instead of the expensive bitter blend Jake preferred, and cried. Not from sadness. From relief. The lavender plants arrived on a Friday, delivered by a teenager in a pickup truck who helped me dig holes in the sandy soil beside the porch steps. They like drainage, he'd said, showing me how deep to plant them. And they'll come back every year if you don't fuss with them too much. I like that philosophy. Don't fuss with them too much. My phone had been silent for 3 weeks now, except for the occasional text from Sarah, my lawyer friend, updating me on legal proceedings. Jake had tried calling exactly 7 times in the first month. I'd counted. But I'd blocked his number after the 4th voicemail where he'd simply breathed into the phone for 30 seconds without saying a word. Sarah's texts painted a picture of a man coming apart at the seams, but doing it quietly, privately, like he was disappearing from the inside out. Resigned from the firm, one message read. Partners voted him out anyway. Apartment downtown, came another. Lease under David Patterson's name. Guess he's embracing the truth now. Melissa filed a restraining order. He was showing up at her office building every day for 2 weeks, just standing across the street. Not approaching, just watching. I'd read each update while sipping coffee on my porch, feeling nothing except mild curiosity. It was like hearing about a character in a book I'd finished reading. The most surprising text had come just last week. Jennifer changed her will. Everything goes to the Pediatric Cancer Foundation and something called the Brooke Carter Scholarship Fund. Jake gets nothing. Not even family photos. I'd had to read that one twice. A scholarship fund in my name. Jennifer's final gesture, perhaps her way of apologizing for 30 years of lies that had eventually entangled me too. The legal resolution had been swift and brutal. Jake's birth certificate was officially amended to list his father as unknown. The Mitchell Family Trust, established in 1923, remained intact but with no living heirs. Robert's estate, worth an estimated $47 million, would be distributed according to Jennifer's revised will. Jake Mitchell, now legally Jake Patterson Mitchell, though he'd have to petition the court to use even that hyphenated version, had no claim to any of it. But the money wasn't what destroyed him. It was the silence that followed. Sarah mentioned it in passing during one of our rare phone calls. He seems to think people are talking about him everywhere he goes. Coffee shops, grocery stores, the gym. But honestly, most people have moved on. There was that senator's affair last month, then the tech CEO's insider trading scandal. Your story got swallowed up by the news cycle. That should have been a relief for Jake. In our social media world, scandals had the lifespan of fruit flies. But apparently he couldn't let it go. I heard from Margaret Whitmore's daughter, Sarah continued. She said Jake showed up at their country club last Sunday. Just sat at the bar for 3 hours, nursing the same drink, staring at people. When someone finally asked if he was all right, he just said, "They remember." But Margaret said nobody was even looking at him. I'd ended that conversation early, suddenly uncomfortable with the second-hand surveillance. Jake's breakdown wasn't my responsibility, and I didn't want to become the kind of person who fed on someone else's misery, even someone who'd tried to feed on mine. The truth was, I rarely thought about him anymore. My days had rhythm now, but not the artificial schedule of social obligations and appearance maintenance that had dominated my married life. I woke when sunlight hit the bedroom window. I walked the shoreline trail that circled the lake. I read books that had nothing to do with self-improvement or networking or being a better wife. In the afternoons, I worked on the vegetable garden I'd started behind the cottage. Tomatoes and herbs and green beans that would probably survive longer than my marriage had. The physical work felt good, honest in a way that charity luncheons and gallery openings never had. Evenings were for the porch swing Ruth had installed after I'd admired a similar one at the hardware store. I'd watch the sky change colors over the water while dinner cooked on the small grill I'd bought myself as a housewarming gift. Simple food. Fish from the local market, vegetables from my garden, bread from the bakery in the nearest town 15 miles away. I'd kept exactly 3 friends from my old life. Sarah, Mrs. Lawton, and surprisingly my former mother-in-law's hospice nurse, Carmen, who'd reached out after Jennifer's funeral to make sure I was doing all right. The rest of that social circle had evaporated naturally, not from any dramatic confrontations but simply because we'd never really been friends anyway. We'd been accessories to each other's public image. Carmen visited sometimes, bringing news from the outside world that felt increasingly foreign. That red-haired girl from the party, she'd mentioned during her last visit. Melissa? She moved back home to Ohio. Deactivated all her social media accounts first. Good for her, I'd said and meant it. Melissa had been collateral damage in Jake's theater of cruelty. She'd probably learned more about herself in the aftermath than she'd bargained for. And your ex-husband, Carmen had continued carefully, he's been asking people about you. Where you went, how you're doing. Nothing threatening, just curious. Like he can't understand why you disappeared so completely. I'd smiled then, really smiled for the first time in that conversation. That's because he never understood who I was in the first place. The cottage had no social media presence. No Instagram-worthy angles or Facebook check-ins. I'd deleted all my accounts the day after I'd moved in, and it had felt like cutting anchor chains. All those years of curating a perfect online life, of documenting experiences instead of actually having them. Jake would never understand that kind of contentment. His entire sense of self had been built on external validation, on being seen and recognized and envied. The idea that someone could find fulfillment in anonymity would be incomprehensible to him. Which was exactly why my silence would torment him more than any revenge I could have planned. He'd wanted an audience for my humiliation. Instead, I'd given him an audience for his destruction and then walked away from the theater entirely. Now he was performing his breakdown for empty seats and I was finally, truly free. If this story of calculated revenge had you absolutely hooked, hit that like button right now. My favorite part was when Brooke handed Jennifer that silk-wrapped box, knowing exactly what would unfold next. What was your favorite moment? Drop it in the comments below. Don't miss more thrilling stories like this. Subscribe and hit that notification bell so you never miss an upload.